Thank you very much. This rendezvous is more like a bar stool conversation. I'm not very sure, and I've been warned by someone in the audience that I should be careful when I sit on one of them. So I might just stand behind one of them, but we'll see. So this rendezvous is on urbanscapes. It's on sustainability, but we all know enough, I think, or we are learning enough about the urban, so I will not go into an introduction. Let me just invite the guests with whom we're going to have a chat. Dr. Annapurna Kamath. Now, very briefly, Dr. Kamath is known by her actions. And I think any kind of introduction to you is superfluous because you're quite an idol, at least for me. She has a doctorate in mathematics and computer science from Bangalore University. She's now the director and managing trustee of the Satya Foundation, director of Shishulok, which is a child resource and learning center, but above all, at least to me, most importantly, the founder trustee of the Jala Poshan, which is a remarkable NGO that is mobilizing ordinary citizens, harnessing local ecological knowledge and community participation in its efforts to save the lakes of Bangalore. The organization is currently best known for its work with the ecological restoration of the Jakkur Lake in North Bangalore. Dr. Chandni Singh, who of course I don't have to introduce, who just addressed us a little earlier, but her primary interests are to look at the drivers of differential vulnerability to climate change, linkages between climate change adaptation and development, and how and why people adapt. She currently co-leads projects on urban sustainability, long-term disaster recovery, and climate resilient development, while in the past she has worked with international and national organizations on community-based watershed management, wetland restoration, and livelihood strengthening. She holds a master's in environmental science from TERI in New Delhi and a doctorate in rural livelihoods from the University of Reading in the UK. Rinan Shah, my new friend, who I met only today. Rinan is a doctoral student, just about finishing her PhD at ATREE, and she has very strong research interests in environment and development, especially across various political, economic contexts. She's currently studying the manifestation of domestic water scarcity in urban mountain towns of the Eastern Himalayan region. And earlier, she was a research fellow under the National Mission on Himalayan Studies and is a contributing author to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Rinan said something very interesting to me when I asked her, what are your primary interests? And she said something that is also my primary interest. And as you could realize from my talk, how do you define the urban? And so I hope we will begin some of our conversations with that. The last friend of mine, Sudhira. Sudhira, of course, obtained his doctorate from the Indian Institute of Science for his thesis on studies on urban sprawl and spatial planning support system for Bangalore, India. His research has primarily been in land use and land cover change studies, exploring their consequences on environmental sustainability and understanding their interrelationships with natural resources using transdisciplinary approaches. He was earlier a faculty member at the Indian Institute of Human Settlements, where he led efforts to map urban land cover and land use changes for 231 cities of India, apart from playing a critical role in the Institute's consulting and advisory services for the government of Karnataka. Right. Okay. This is that moment. With that long, hopefully, and not having fallen over. Thank you. So, let this be a conversation. But please do feel free to hold forth on something that's very close to your heart. Shall we then quickly begin with how do each of you perceive the urban?
Yeah, so from where I live, it's still a peri-urban kind of a structure. But yes, we seeing it like, it is a confused world where people kind of have been coexisting before, and now it is looking a little strange because there's a migrant crowd coming to that space and who don't relate with nature and the non-humans around. So we're finding it, that transition is still on in that area. So urban for us is, probably a kind of a mixture of humans and non-humans and coexistence, which is a little difficult, but yes, that is where we are.
But do you think the urban, when you say the urban, it becomes a category. Is it really a category? Or is it a continuum where one doesn't really know when the urban begins, and it might get defined only if you're talking about certain aspects of the so-called urban?
Yeah, because as I told you, because it's a peri-urban area, for us it is still, that's why I said it's confusing, because there's no kind of a demarcation. I mean, I cannot say this is urban and this is not. Yeah. So that's where we stand, So it is a kind of a transition, and actually there is no much of a definition of urban per se, but I think it's humans who bring it into it and try to define it more selfishly, I would say, to, probably meet our needs. That's where it is.
But let me just add to that, the elephants are equally confused. When you see an elephant in Mysore, it's possibly because it doesn't realize where she is supposed to be or where she's not supposed to be, because it has become a continuum even physically.
Yeah, I think...
Yeah. Oh, all right, sure. Otherwise, I shall call loudly.
Yeah. Or maybe they need to call to us. Yeah, I think for me, the urban areas and cities, I think, are such a contradiction. So I live in this complex, and that's through lived experience. I live in this complex that whatever builder name, and in the word, there's misty waters. And my flat looks out to this really polluted lake, and that's the misty waters, the lovely mists of it every morning, actually. And then there are various things that I end up doing, like agarbattis and flowers and things to just make sure. So I think that contradiction of this, again, the vision and aspiration of these lovely names that the builders come up with, where you've got Boulevard so-and-so, and then of course the whole, I don't know, the California inspired names and all of that. So that vision of modernity that we are coming towards, but then also the reality of the messiness and the filth really of our cities and the inequality of our cities. So I think there's that. And a lot of people I speak to and work with always say that everyone's wanting to come to the city. So this idea of the urban as a dream. But once you come to the city, you actually just want to go back to where you were coming from often because of the reality of our cities. So I think it's, to me, the urban is like this contradiction, I think both in my own lived experience, but also just when you go out to our cities, you want to get to lovely lakes in Bangalore, but the traffic just kills you, So every day is almost a contradiction in our urban areas,
Rinan?
I think the definition of urban, I would like to look at it from two aspects. Firstly is the very definition of what is urban, especially by the Indian census. They define urban only based on population, because that's the only factor that they say if your population is, say, below 1 lakh, you are class 2, so on and so forth. However, your city, the urbanization definition rarely includes some of the aspects you all mentioned about basic amenities, about, geographical differences. So one is that aspect of, urban which doesn't get looked at. I think so probably we might need to look at an updated definition of urban, what is an urban. And secondly, even using the definition of urban, so what is created is this imagery of the urban metropole. So everybody thinks that urban ought to look that way, right? It has to be, a sprawling city. So because I work on the mountains, I am from the mountains, so whenever we talk about the mountains, there are other aspects that come in, which rarely get recognized, even in the visualization of the urban. Yeah, thanks.
So thank you, Rinan. I had a response to that. One of my own interests is in non-human consciousness. And I realize now that we would understand non-human consciousness even better if we abolish the term. Because everybody has this holy grail of what they define as consciousness. So here's a thought experiment. What if we looked at development as a continuum and avoided using words like urban or rural? This is a thought experiment. Do you think it would help us in some ways? Or because I'll tell you why. Because even within a city, and I'm sure this is comfortable ground for you, even within a city, there's so much of disparity in development, in amenities, in the various ways we even treat the citizens of different parts of the city. What does it mean? It means such different, it's completely different for every individual. So why have this term?
I think I'm at the juncture of finishing my PhD and getting a job, so I'll have to put myself in some bracket. Yeah, so I might have to call myself either like an urban researcher or a rural. Probably, maybe later down the line I can see something. But I do agree because you have urban spaces within the rural within the urban. So I think the definition also probably becomes important because journals ask you to publish papers that way. So it's like a lot of complications before we define.
I guess thank you for this wonderful question to initiate this discussion. I think at large, right, I think the notion of urban has been a more recent development. I think we should take a step back to view it from a lens of evolution of human social organization. As in, we all know how we have evolved from hunter-gatherers to initial settlers. And perhaps in the last 200, 300 years, post-industrialization is when urbanization set in. And this didn't really happen in India much early on, but we are transitioning wherein people are moving, like I would like to call it as evolution of human social organization, into living in large settlements, right? Where what happened in Europe, Northwestern Europe and North America, where there were industrialization, where jobs were there, people moved in, agriculture became mechanized and things like that. But here we are moving to larger settlements amidst the process of industrialization. We are not fully industrialized, but we are dependent on a services-based economy there. So it's in a flux, so to say. So it's really interesting to see what's happening. And then the other challenge, I think, perception from our human sense, the way we would want to look at is, we really want to look at understanding and defining things. And like we see in ecology or from an evolution perspective, right? It's really hard to pinpoint and things like that. Now, speaking of definitions, right? We have multiple definitions. Now, Census of India, like you pointed out, also has two other criteria, as in to call any settlement as urban. Apart from any, so there are three criteria. One of them is that saying any settlement with having a population over 5,000 persons and a density of 300 persons per square kilometer, and unfortunately, more than 75% of male working population in non-agricultural activities. You should take a look at this. And this definition has been there since 1871, unfortunately. And similarly, we have multiple definitions, like the Karnataka Municipalities Act also decides how should you define an urban. And based on that, there are different categories. Like when we say a city is a city corporation or a city, municipality or things like that, even then, while adopting a variant of what census defines, now in Karnataka, the cities they also add another layer to it, saying how much of revenue does this city generate, while still relaxing the definition, saying only 50% of male working population involved in non-agricultural activities. Now, I now live in a place called Gubbi, which is 90 kilometers northwest of Bangalore, and I see that that's largely agrarian. Although officially it is qualified as an urban because we are a town now, but I don't see more than 50% of male working population engaged in non-agricultural activities, right? But it's a sort of a paradox. So if you try to look at definitions and try to see them in that lens in particular, we find it as a challenge. So on the contrary, we also try to look at, since I also work with satellite remote sensing data, we try to see how cities are growing in terms of built up areas and things like that. Now, if you look at something that we did maybe about 10 years ago while I was at IIHS, about top 100 cities, right? They occupy less than 0.4% of the land resource, and they contribute to more than 25% of the globe, national economy, things like that. So there's a contrasting view of how do you want to view what, and if we get into the messy issues of definitions, then we will perhaps get lost. But I think the question is to be under what context are we viewing things in that sense?
Yeah, so that is a nice point for me to come to you, Annapurna, because you've been working with local communities, right? Whether for the protection of lakes or ecological restoration, or so do you see a sense of belonging that is important for the kind of volunteering that you see when people come to you every Sunday morning and they want to help clean up the lake? What kind of identification do they have with the urban?
Yeah, so when we speak about the lake, specifically Jakur Lake in context, we have kind of tried to build the community and engage the community in conservation through their interest. Like we say, what is close to your heart, and now how that can connect to the lake.
Right.
So some people come to run there, some people come for jogging, some people come with family, some people come for livelihood, some people come, the reason that they come to the lake may be different, but we say you should love what you're doing there, so that you know that this lake is very important to me, and because I run there, I will conserve it. It's more so something else is driving it. It could not be one single thing that's a driver, but everybody connects. But yes, ownership is very important, and that's what has made our, conservation a success, because every person in the community takes pride in what has happened to the lake and feels that it is my lake.
Wonderful.
And that is very, very important.
That's wonderful. So coming to Rinan, since you've worked on the Himalayan towns, I would think that ecological restoration or taking care of the environment, whether urban or whatever we call it, might be much more closely linked to survival in some sense, right? So she talked about recreation. Now, yes, that must be important as well, but it's also a question of making sure you have your water and making sure you have your little plot of land where you can grow your plants. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think largely I would probably speak from my study site, which is Darjeeling urban town. The urban town is very small. It's only around 11 square kilometers. So on the one side you have, there are all state organizations around. On the one side you have the forests, on the other side you have tea plantations, then you have cantonments. So you already are existing in a very restricted space. So, but I would, so there's no, so what would you conserve? I wouldn't know there's anything much to conserve, except probably the springs that are within town, but also the land as you speak of it, as we saw it during the presentations, also is considered as a very high real estate values, and even spots which had been, demarcated, quote unquote, beautification spots or viewpoint spots for tourists have all been taken over. So there really isn't anything that people haven't built on. So you have public toilets that have been built upon, right? So that's one. And regarding conservation, I think some of the scholars have already written about how conservation is not always for the better of the environment, but is also an important constraint that you are working on the constraint. So conservation then becomes your imperative or your seeded behavior. So I think that is what happens in the case of Darjeeling, where when you talk about springs, it might not be for the environment, but because, yeah, as you said, there's no water.
Yeah. One thing that has always intrigued me, and this has intrigued me because I worked primarily with more than humans who don't have a voice, by and large. But in the so-called urban, we have too many voices. Of course, some voices are heard louder than are others. How would you, in your respective work, how do you reconcile with this? How do you know who to listen to? How do you know that some voices need to be heard a little more than they are? I'm sure there's no simple answer to this, but I just want to know how you think about this. Any of you can go. By the way, please let me know when our time's up, because I've lost track of time. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I can take that first just to start us off. Of course, there are the non-human voiceless and there are the human voiceless as well. And while I do work more with the communities that we talk of as marginalized, whether based on caste, gender, or other, axes of whatever, social differentiation, I think there is, of course, this effort, and I feel especially places like Bangalore, there is increasingly this civic awareness around the fact that there are certain people who can make their voice known and others who can't. So there are, and I feel that's where really thinking about, instead of our top-down ways of expecting the government to provide these public for it has to be citizens coming. And I think Bangalore does that quite well to some extent. But on the other non-human side, now where I live, which is actually not far from where you are, around Kempepura, part of Bangalore, where there are lakes that have they no longer function as lakes, but still a lot of people bring their livestock every day to feed on the grasses that are growing now, which on the lake bed. So I feel that there is, but over time living in these areas, I've seen that there's a shrinking of that grass space, there's shrinking because of built up area. Spaces that these livestock were kept in are now shrinking, and lots of people in these gated communities talk about the menace that these animals are causing while still wanting to buy the milk that is considered pure from these very animals. So it's an interesting, again, a contradiction, and I think we don't often in our cities, and that's a problem with, I think, particular to cities where we don't talk about non-human voices, and I don't think we have good models of, while we have better models for marginalized communities, we don't have good models for bringing those kind of voices into these conversations, I think.
Here I would just like to bring in Sudhira, because I know your interest is also in the legal aspects of urbanization. So how do you account for unheard voices?
Yeah, again, another wonderful question there. I guess there are no simple answers to it. And again, the way we are looking now cities as really complex socio-ecological systems. And it's not, unfortunately, linear in the sense where you could be able to look at what is happening in that sense. And the start to it, I think, is applying systems thinking to look at what's happening across and identifying what is going on across different scales and both spatial and temporal, and also understanding what's really on that front. Now, coming to the legal aspects, right? Now, one of the things that I now look at is on our planning process. In a sense, all of us know, we also heard that there is some, Bangalore City Climate Action and Resilience Plan and things like that. We also had comprehensive mobility mobility plan, and we had infrastructure development investment plan. There was a city development plan that the BBMP did about 10, 12 years ago. But none of these, unfortunately, are enforceable or implementable. They will remain as plans. I have seen in the last 10, 15 years. Now, what remains to be enforceable are only the comprehensive development plan or the revised master plan that is prepared by the Bangalore Development Authority under the Karnataka Town and Country Planning Act of 1961. Right? 1961. Please remember that. We are following an act that was made in 1960s to prepare master plans, and that remains. This is not true only for Karnataka, because respective states have also made their own Town and Country Planning Acts. All of it have been borrowed from the British Town and Country Planning Acts. Now, we have had new understandings, we are able to have better dialogue on cities. We have newer thinking of it. We have newer models. Technologies are there, satellite data is there. I can grab something from 2 days ago and things like that. We are talking about smart cities and all of that. But none of this is really enforceable, because today our act says, based on Town and Country Planning Act, that land use plan has to be made in geometrically well laid out static plans. They don't account for water, energy, other infrastructure, wastewater treatment, solid waste management, mobility, health, education, I can name, and even ecology, right? If you look at the unheard voices there, we have isolated population of slender loris inside IISc campus. Now, they are not factored in because it's not part of your master plan, because we can't account to them. Or sometime around 2005, one of my friends from CES, she described a new species of ant from here. Now, we can't account for them because our act doesn't permit it. Now, something that I really like about the Dutch is that they have revised their planning laws. So there is a new Spatial Planning Act of 2008. And something that we haven't been really up for it is thinking of a new planning act. I think that is where we have to go and look at how we are able to transform from making static, sort of participatory planning process that happens now to a more participative, bottom-up, and dynamic planning support system. I think that's the way to go forward.
Yeah, I mean, that would be in an ideal situation, but day to day, till all of that happens, we have to go with individual decision-making processes, and I therefore wanted to, again, come back to you, Annapurna. So, do you find this conflict, right? Even yesterday, we had some discussion on these concepts of overfishing or over-harvesting, which are not often borne out. More importantly, borne out by data or research. More importantly, it's a question of perceptions, right? So suppose when you work on the lakes in Bangalore, there are a section of the population, a community comes to you and says, oh, we can't have fishing here. But may have been people who've been living there for the last 200 years who've been traditionally fishing there. How do you resolve this problem?
Yeah, so this is a very common thing for us that happens because, there is one part of the community which is more on the human part of it. Like they always think about what do we want from the lake. So in the action plan, you'll always get recreation, have a gym, have a park and things like that. And then there is this community which is probably bird watchers and researchers. They would always want to see as lake as an ecosystem. And sometimes it tends to get very extremist also, like the environmentalists say don't do anything human intensive, and these people say no, it is our lake, we have to do it. So it is a tendency for the conflict is always there, but we always go the middle way, like in a balance. So at the Jakkur Lake, what we've also done is we've created two zones. One is what we call as community zone, which is a human intensive zone, and one part which we call as conservation zone, which is for the lake dwellers. And this is what we time and again try to drive to the community, ki it is all about coexistence. So lakes are urban commons and a space for human beings as well as the lake dwellers. So if you want to make it very human intensive, then where are these going to go? Like, very simple example is of snakes, reptiles. Everybody wants the reptiles out of the lake. So everybody suggests put fluoride, put something. And the moment they see some caterpillars in the tree, they say spray some pesticide, we want them out. And then you have to converse, dialogue, and tell them how important they are for your existence. So this is an ongoing process. For the past 7 years, we've been doing it. Talk to people, make them understand the importance of coexistence and not trying to drive them out, but try to live with them. It is difficult, but it is possible.
So in this context, coming back to what Sudhira was saying, do you find that there is a lacuna in legal provisions which could have potentially helped you resolve some of these issues if there is conflict of opinion?
Could be, but more so I find that, like for example, the lakes in Bangalore, most of them fall under BBMP. So probably as a policy, if BBMP can understand that lakes are a coexisting space and they don't look at it only from one angle of human or a civil engineering kind of a thing, and they always make space for, which is happening now. They are very cooperative, and at Jakkur we have piloted a lot of these projects of balancing. So I think that is equally important, policy changes where this becomes part of it. And yes, legal support whenever it doesn't go right. Like whenever we are not able to get our way, then, if there is a legal support we can fall back on, it becomes easy for the community because, as you said, we cannot be a one voice. Right. I mean, we cannot say you're right or you're right. We'll have to make sure that everybody is happy in the community, and at the end, the lake per se also survives as an ecosystem, right, not just like a beautification component of the community.
Okay, so I've seen a little board go up which converts our little beastly place into a regulated animal space. We have to leave in 5 minutes. So I would like some last reflections, and maybe I should bring in the catchword sustainability because that's what the discussion was all about. Of course, again, that requires definition, but let's not go there. Any last thoughts about urbanization, about where we should be going next?
Yeah, so sustainability for me would be, understanding the situation and the need to work together as a community and, as coexistence also, because non-humans are equally important for the existence of the humans. So maybe thinking on a holistic angle and making sure everybody is accommodated is what I would say is
lovely.
Sustainability.
That's so nice. Chandni?
I think for me, sustainability, I think we tend to always forget this temporal element of sustainability. So what we are seeing today and the problems that we are seeing today and the solutions we find to them are sort of locking us into more and more unsustainable trajectories. So for me, from all the literature on pathways thinking, I think it's really helpful for us to start thinking about that. So when we talk about these community-led initiatives, thinking about the pathways that they can have for sustainability. But of course, government-led or more planning-led initiatives and how they really, either open up spaces for others or close down some spaces. So I really urge, everyone who's thinking about sustainability to please keep thinking about that temporal angle and how are we thinking of cities and these peri-urban spaces as they change, not as static. And so even our methods and questions that we ask of these spaces have to be temporally informed.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks. Rinan?
Yeah, I think adding to what Chandni said, temporally, but also I feel historically, we might have to look back and see how your cities have developed, how unjust they have been, especially under colonization. So remembering the history of development of the city probably would lead, because I think the division that has been created is not gone, right? The city is still an unjust city. So probably recalling the history and also including your history while planning for your future sustainability.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to quote Professor Michael Batty here. Like, despite a century of efforts on understanding cities, our understanding of cities is woefully inadequate. So I think we'll have to make more efforts to understand what's going on, and then but he also adds that only then we'll think of interventions, but in more meaningful ways, right? I guess that's where we have to look forward.
Thank you very much. And my last concluding thought, listening to all of you, is, woo! Thank you very much.
Yes.